Welcome to the Coffee and Scotch eSports Show. I'm your host, Bowman Shota, and if you tuned in for our regular eSports Hero Cafe show, we've actually rebranded a little bit, so we're going to have a little bit more fun, but same show, same serious topics. So cheers to all of you that keep tuning in, and cheers to you, Carleigh. Carleigh Morgan as my guest for today's episode. How you
Cheers,
doing,
David.
Carleigh?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Good, good. So today, I'm very excited to have you on as our guest because it's an interesting topic, especially with this week's the craziness in the news that has been happening. And we're going to be diving into regulations and a little bit of a subtopic with exploitation in the esports scene. So, but before we get all serious, first off, Carleigh, go ahead and give the viewers a little bit of background about who you are and how you're involved in esports.
Sure thing. Well, firstly, I should just thank you for asking me to be on the show. It's a pleasure to be asked. Secondly, I have kind of an unconventional pathway leading me into esports. So I grew up playing Pokemon and platform puzzle games on my Game Boy Color, but didn't really have a console or dabbled in the console games a bit. But always felt like I was kind of missing out on the significant cultural force that video games was for so many of my peers. Until I got to grad school and I took a really enthralling course called Literature, Play, and Games. And that introduced me to a whole spectrum of different critiques about video games and opened up the possibility to do video game theory. So I'm currently conducting a PhD on esports and have sort of a macro view of the scene. I spectate a lot of esports and I'm really interested in learning more about it, but I'm absolutely awful as a competitor. I will say that right off the bat.
That's okay. And with where you're focusing and what we've talked about previously, people like you in the industry are going to have a huge impact on the longevity of the scene, at least in my own opinion. So, but
I would certainly hope that would be the case. It's one of my goals to leave a personal handprint on shaping the industry in a sustainable, progressive, and positive way. But whether that occurs remains to be seen. Working towards that.
Nice, nice. Now, to kind of start off into this whole craziness of the week, the week started off back on, I believe it was Sunday night into Monday, with Riot releasing a couple different rulings on the banning of TIP and Renegades. And the more controversial one was Renegades. The tip one seemed to be fairly straightforward. They didn't pay their players. They didn't have evidence of showing to pay their players. And they lost their LCS spot because of breaking fairly straightforward rules. So that wasn't too much of a shock. What was a shock was the Renegades ban. And especially how they announced it and the reaction from it from people in Renegades. And still to this day, I haven't seen an official statement from anyone affiliated with Renegades. I guess you kind of have the one Reddit post, which was the guy exclaiming basically he had no clue about any of this and was completely reading it as soon as we were as well. But can you go into how Riot can make rulings like how they banned Renegades based on evidence that they haven't shown us, at least, based on that type of thing? How can they make rulings like that?
So I think one of the things I'd like to look at first is that it's really important to keep in mind the jargon that Riot is using here. And I think the whole fact that they're using this term ruling is effectively a PR instrument, and it's very misleading. And I think it's a deliberate choice on their part in the terms of how they're crafting this announcement and the rhetoric that they're using to sort of sculpt the narrative around this ruling system. So I think why it's critical that we examine the language Riot is using is because the term ruling implies some sort of judiciary decision or mandate carried out after a fair trial where there's an objective third party weighing arguments from two conflicting people or organizations and ultimately adjudicating between them, delivering this ruling as a resolution. But this isn't really the case. So Riot has conducted a very secretive, very hush-hush operation and then announced the result of this operation in terms of a ruling, but they haven't presented evidence to the public. So they've talked about the fact that they have evidence, ample enough evidence, to make this ruling on what they consider to be stable ground. They feel like this is the right decision to be made at this time. But they're not obligated or bound under any form of the way the laws are organized to release this evidence to the public. So that's really problematic, I think. The whole thing, from the investigative probe all the way to Riot's decision and public announcement, was conducted behind closed doors, where there's no third party to hold Riot to transparency or accountability. There's no system of checks and balances, and there's no way for us to know what criteria they're using to determine what constitutes evidence. So I think all of those things need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at Riot's rulings.
Nice, nice. Now, to transition into the bigger topic of regulation. Now, there's been an announcement this week, obviously, with the WESA, and I don't want to touch base on them, but in regulation in general, as far as, and you touched base on a little bit there, to where it gets narrowed down sometimes too much to that individual problem, that individual issue. But at the same time, we need something that's on the large scale, that handles entire leagues, that handles the entire scene. Obviously, is the goal. I don't think that will happen soon, but we need proper regulation. So how would we go about getting that type of regulation, and how do regulations play a part in helping reduce the amount of things that happen, like exploitation?
Okay, so I can parse your question a little more clearly. So as it stands now, regulation in the esports industry isn't consistent or clear, and it's not standardized from place to place. It's also mostly in the hands of massive organizations, which aren't subject to third-party review. And when crafting regulations or designing rules or figuring out how they want their infrastructure to look, they're probably going to do it in a way that is tilted towards their own interests, their own policies, and ultimately their own monetary gain. So what we really need is a regulation that can be made to favor players, to favor the grassroots end of the esports spectrum, and regulations that are put together by an assemblage of individuals all across the board at different levels, different positions in the hierarchy, with different interests and experiences, and insights to bring to the negotiation and bargaining table, so that we can have a compromise that isn't just at the executive level, but it is at a level that effectively and equally represents the insights from individual players all the way up to the CEOs of global multinational organizations who are sponsoring some of these tournaments. I think one of the other things I'd like to take the opportunity to point out is that lately there seems to be this tremendous focus on the word transparency. And everyone is calling for transparency for organizations like Riot, and calling for transparency in disclosing the specific details of contracts, or disclosing the founding documents for new organizations. And I think, slight nod to WESA. And I think we keep hitting on this buzzword of transparency, but I would caution people to take a step back and just take a look at the obsession with transparency. We tend to valorize it as a good thing in and of itself, but transparency is totally ineffective if there isn't a third party around or a system around to enforce responses to unethical industry practices that transparency reveals. So I keep picking on Riot, but it's just because I'm most familiar with the way that Riot operates. So this is no discredit to Riot. But hypothetically, like, Riot could go on a rampage, right? They could completely and publicly disclose something like shady industry practices, any questionable business dealings they might have, some discriminatory hiring practices internally at their organization. They could announce unfair team agreements, and they could publish all of this to a public platform for review and comment and scrutiny. But if there isn't a regulatory body to act on any of this information, released precisely because of this call and insistency for transparency, then transparency itself has accomplished nothing. So I think transparency without action is just not the way to go. We need transparency plus action if we're going to see anything come of the call for access to the documents I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you see a news article of a crime that happened, and they may not necessarily release the details, but they release what they're convicted of.
Hmm.
And because sometimes, well, I guess the question is, sometimes the general public, it shouldn't need to know how someone murdered someone else, but at the same time, should there be an avenue for that information to be gained, if requested?
Right. Well, the point in your example is that if someone confesses to a murder, there is a system in place to deal with that individual. That individual will face repercussions, and they'll have to go through a trial. There's a judicial process by which their actions are evaluated, and they're either marked as innocent or guilty. So the transparency here, just the statement that I murdered somebody does absolutely nothing unless there's a third party to come in and cast judgment on that issue. So there needs to be someone, if we're talking about transparency in the esports industry, there needs to be an organization like a watchdog agency, like a regulatory agency, an executive committee pulled together from all different parts of the industry globally that can take these problems and take these whatever guilty organizations are being investigated, can take them to task when transparency does turn over something that looks a little questionable.
That wraps it up for today's video of the Coffee and Scotch Esports Show. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning it out. Like, share, follow, subscribe. Also, check out more great content on esports.online. But other than that, you all have a wonderful day.